and welcome to the Gauntlet podcast. Each month, we look back at games played by Gauntlet folks, and we talk about that. We have a topic brought by our guest. My name is Lowell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm joined today by my co-host, Sherri. Sherri, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Today, we're joined by Mike Ferdinando. Mike is a longtime Gauntlet player, joined the Gauntlet in 2018. Mike has run a lot of really interesting stuff on the Gauntlet. I know that he's also run for Pelgrane at conventions and things, and has done his time in the Pathfinder mines and has come here to join us.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
For our first segment, each of us gets to go over the RPGs that we played in February, March, and we talk in depth about one game that we played on the Gauntlet calendar. So, Sherri, how was your February, March?
It was good. It was more busy than I thought it was until I looked back and I was like, oh, I did play a chunk of games. However, most of them are parts of series, so it may not sound as many as it could. So we finished off a Hearts of Wulin campaign that was lovely and started a Dunes Adventure in the Imperium campaign. 13th Age continues. This is all off Gauntlet. Also off Gauntlet was a Ballad Bayan playtest and a playtest of a Persona-style game that's still, got a name that they may go with or not, so we won't worry about it, but it was an interesting take on it and actually really effective for getting the feel. So on Gauntlet, though, played Godbound and then Star Wars Saturday's Burning Hearts Forever. What I'm going to talk about, actually, is the Star Wars Saturday's Burning Hearts Forever. So Burning Hearts Forever is the system. It's a PBTA game with little blades in the mix. That's by Eva Terra. You can find it on itch.io and Drive-Thru RPG. It's definitely a Hearts variant of PBTA. The designer provides additional material for supporting anime-style scenarios like Mecha Pilots and after-school heroes akin to Persona, rock band tours, that sort of thing. But we played it as Star Wars, so we were young Jedi. And this game wears its Monster Hearts DNA on its sleeve, and the moves and the stats, everything is super tied to emotion. But it's in some really interesting and keenly written mystical heart move tech that defines the tech, magic, superpowers of each playbook. So it's not what I was expecting, and I ended up being really, really excited by it once we got into play. So what worked for me was that the playbooks really had that heart tech was cool. It's very flexible. I could give you some examples. For instance, there's a character playbook called the Dreadnought, and what they're very good at is defending. But they have, when you go to define your heart, you get to choose 3 different styles of heart. So for the Dreadnought, who's a defender, they can choose a heavy heart. That gives them a little bit of harm that they can dish out, that there's a hand weapon, and that they have armor, heavy armor. Or they get another heart that's called a pushing heart, and essentially you're forceful, and you can choose to push people where you want for free in once per session. And then another one is called a restless heart. So each of you, even you're going to build this thing, but you choose what your weapon is, but it's also a statement about how you are as well. And then you can choose extras that make this weapon or heart different. And that can be things for the Dreadnought. They choose between things like, if you get lots of conditions like you're hurt, you actually get more armor. And you can have wide range and things like this. It sounds like, oh, this is going to be hitting people with things, but it can be a power. It can be magic. It can be music. And what's really interesting when I went to look through the game and the system itself is that on its offer at Itch and Drive-Thru is there's a scenarios PDF that comes with it, and it goes through a whole set of different kinds of games that you can play that they've written the scenarios for. And so they have After School Struggle, which is teenagers fight shadows with the powers of their true selves to uncover a mystery, or Mecha Pilots and Highways on Fire, where they're racers who are going across the countryside in a Grand Prix, and a rock band, the Rocking Tour, part-time magical kid, and also just fighting off the apocalypse. So this has all been thought of, and it sounds like, oh, it can't do all those things, but actually those hearts are really flexible, but they are not generic at all. They are really this is my emotional power, and it's my power. So really good playbooks, an interesting approach to them. I was very struck by it, and it actually played very smoothly in-game. I think it worked fabulous as force powers for young Jedi students, because you know what? You are always out of control in the game in a certain way because your emotions are so key. The stats are named after emotions. All of your interactions and moves are affecting yourself and the other people that you're working with. And each playbook has sort of different mechanics to it. So some of the playbooks like build things up. Other ones are like using their conditions to power up or using certain situations that occur to power up and things like that. So they're very different and you get a really different feel with them. The other thing that I liked is that they had a little bit of Blades tech in it, is that this game has a downtime with a defined set of recovery moves, like you get 2 of them. So it gives you a sense of, oh, I'm going to get into conflict, but I have a sense of, have I really hurt myself, or is this going to be just, I take a little rest and I'll be fine? It does give you that sense, and it lets you choose things for, I'm doing pretty good, so I can go for color or relationship, or I have to heal and I need to heal, or if I go for relationship, I'm going to be hurting next that comes in. So it lets you as the player make some choices for like what kind of drama you want, what kind of story you want. Love that. It's a place where I'd like to see that Blades tech. Unfortunately, for me, it does have that Monster Hearts thing to it, so it means it has strings in it. And for me, that is like a tech that I have never played in a game, like a series, long enough to actually get to that point where I'm comfortable with strings. They feel so strange to me. And like when I'm using them and people are telling me this is what I do, I go, okay, yep, that worked. Okay. Different dice. All right. I get to add +1. That's awesome. But I never have that feel for it. So that's me, though. That is entirely a me thing. But that was the one thing that I was like, whoops, it's got strings, just like, Monster Hearts has strings. So, and then the other thing that made me a little sad is we didn't get to play the last session. And mind you, it was all for good reasons. People had good things happening, so they couldn't make it. But I still kind of mourn that. We didn't get to do the resolution of the storyline. So I don't think that would have revealed any more of the mechanics or how the system worked to me, but I myself mourned the loss of that session. I do have to say, though, I think if you want to tell a really good episodic story with a sort of super gifted young folks that are trying to solve a problem, this actually is a really flexible system for it. And the designer has gone to the trouble of making scenarios to give you examples of how to mold the system to the different kinds of stories. And I was struck, I always dig a game where different playbooks are going to really change the feel of the game. And since every one of the playbooks handles emotion and emotions, their own emotions and their interactions with other players in a different way, this means that any combination of playbooks is going to feel very different than any other combination. So you're going to get, like, even if you use the system multiple times, you're going to get very different feels depending on the playbooks that people have chosen. And very much more so than just different players. I think I would almost say that it's up there with like the Veil for having that sort of what playbooks are chosen are going to be what kind of story you're going to get. And so I loved it. And I say if you're looking for something that's going to give you some flexibility and you got a setting in your mind that's not like got a system already written for it, you might consider this if it's young adults, you want emotion, and they've got some powers. maybe great weapons, maybe a mecha, maybe any of those things, but you can make this system work for it. And again, you can find it on itch.io, and it's on drive-thru too. It's by Eve Terra, and it's actually pretty spectacular.
Well, that sounds really cool. I hadn't encountered that game before. I will definitely have to check it out.
Yeah, Rich found it, and he said, I really like this game. And I was like, okay. And I have to agree with him. He was right on the money on it.
Is it in the sort of the vein of the rules light, sort of very light PBTA, or is it thicker than that, I guess I want to say?
It feels very classic. When I say it wears its Monster Hearts DNA very much on its sleeve in the sense that it's about that same weight with it, but it doesn't have monstrousness to it as the theme. It is more about, this heart, and that the way you process things, your heart is doing that the same way. So you have like sort of this total thing. And so while you can make each other's lives very miserable as fellow players, it's not about you actually being overtly unable to control that. You just, if you are a dreadnought, you're going to try to defend people, even though that's going to make them feel bad about themselves because you don't think that they can handle it, and you're going to be taking on burdens that are going to be too much for you. So you're going to have that kind of character. Yeah, the hero complex. But you're not like, you're not a werewolf versus a vampire, and
Right.
you're not going to ruin your lives that way. You're ruining them based on your personality and your way you process emotion. It's great, and it was very dramatic. We had lots of good scenes between the players and between, and people dealing internally with those things, just their own stuff. And then also when the two of you would meet up, perfect. It just like all the moves supported, just the way that people trying to do the best thing can really mess each other's lives up.
I did have one quick question on that, and you said that this game had some Blades tech in it.
Mm-hmm.
What was that?
Just the downtime with the two sets of recovery moves is what I would say seems explicitly Blades-like as opposed to just straight PBTA. It's the defined number of recoveries.
Cool.
It's been interesting to see games like that and now Void Heart Symphony that have a real structure and then have like opportunity cost for actions in between.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, tell us about your February March.
Well, I had a very full gaming calendar in February and March. Off Gauntlet, I ran a session of Bluebeard's Bride for Magpie Games' monthly community play day. I was also asked by Alexi Sargent of Cloven Pine Games to play in an exhibition game of their Back Again from the Broken Land game. Played that on Twitch for GaryCon 14, and that was a whole lot of fun. That was actually my first time on Twitch. Also been playing a bunch of games in various home groups. I started GMing Call of Cthulhu, The Secret of Castanegro, which I heard about on Fear of a Black Dragon. And I haven't GM'd Call of Cthulhu since the 90s, and it was not quite like getting back on a bicycle. There's definitely some tension there with my story game brain trying to run classic COC, but we're having fun with it. Lowell, you mentioned that I was recovered from the Pathfinder game, and
from the depths of the Pathfinder minds.
From the depths, thank you. Well, I delved back into that because I am still playing Pathfinder First Edition. I'm continuing to play in a weekly Pathfinder First Edition game. We're going through the Shattered Star adventure path, and we've been playing that game with a bunch of my friends that I've known for like 20 years. I think we're like a year and a half into that series.
Oof.
We're like up to level 12 now, started at first. Other games that I've been playing in an Impulse Drive series, I've been playing in a Monster of the Week series, and I'm playing in a Castles and Crusades series.
Wow.
On the Gauntlet, on the regular Gauntlet calendar, I've been GMing a quarterly series of Old School Essentials, where we've been running through the Against the Slave Lords classic series that was written for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition back in 1981. And I thank and/or blame Jim Crocker for that one, for suggesting that. But we are having a ball. I'm really enjoying this game.
Oh, good.
It's really a lot of fun. And I've been learning a lot about OSR play because I hadn't GM'd OSR in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in my next section, I think I'm going to talk about applying story game techniques in OSR play. But I'll hold that for a little later. For Gauntlet Community Open Gaming, I played in a GM-less sci-fi game called Ask the Stars, which I'd never heard of before, and that was really a lot of fun. I think the GM imported a few techniques from Lovecraft-esque when we played this game. That game's interesting in that you use a lot of like random tables and an in-game oracle. And the other thing is this is a game that only used D12s. Never encountered one of those before. I GM'd 3 games for GCOG. I GM'd a one-shot of Trophy Gold, where we ran the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow. I ran a game of Punk's Been Dead Since '79, which was also really a lot of fun. And I also ran a game of Spirit of 77, a little adventure I called Bermuda Love Triangle. And that's the game I want to talk about.
I just want to say, what a wondrous range of games there. Just dynamite list.
Well, thank you. I like to shake things up and play different things. So I'd like to talk about Spirit of 77. I had a lot of fun in GCOG, but the SO77 game was the one I think I had the most fun at. So Spirit of 77, it's an older PBTA game. Spirit of 77 is the game of 1970s pop culture action and adventure. It was written by David Kizia and Bob Richardson. It was published in 2015 by Monkey Fun Studios. This game is designed to do like over-the-top action stories inspired by 1970s like action movies and TV series. So some of the touchstones are Smokey and the Bandit, The $6 Million Man, Starsky and Hutch, The Rockford Files, and The Dukes of Hazzard. The tech of the game is interesting. It's I think it's one of the earliest games that includes an advantage mechanic where you roll 3 dice, where instead of taking +1 forward, you roll 3 dice and you take the top 2. In the game that calls it rolling with something extra. And I think that was the first game I had encountered that used an advantage mechanic. Another interesting tech that this game uses is a split playbook, where you have a role, and that's basically your profession, and you take a second playbook that's your story or your background. And each of those have a set of playbook moves. You generally get 1 or 2 for free, and then you pick 1 or 2 from the list. So you start with basically 3 playbook moves for your story and 2 playbook moves for your role. And they're all about like 1970s like character archetypes. So the roles are things like the rocker, where you're like the rock band guy. There's the sleuth, if you wanted to be, Columbo or Jim Rockford. There's the tough guy. So, if you want to be John Shaft. There's the honeypot, which is the character that uses their charm and guile. And there's a few others. Roles are things like war vet or ex-con or former badge, where you're an ex-cop. Or Kung Fu, or one of my favorites is Glam. And again, each one gives you a couple of playbook moves. And it does XP on a miss, like a lot of PBTA games. So the adventure that I ran was a scenario that I wrote. I called it Bermuda Love Triangle, which was basically, imagine if the Love Boat sailed into the Bermuda Triangle while it was showing an exhibition of the secrets of King Tut's tomb. And I think the valuable lesson that our player characters learn is, don't take cursed items from ancient Egypt and bring them into the Bermuda Triangle. Bad things will happen. So what worked for me about this game? I think this game just does a great job of genre emulation. I mean, that's true of PBTA games in general, but I think this game just really, really does a bang-up job of it. The playbooks just really do a great job of capturing like the zeitgeist of the 70s. The tone of the book, I think, really gets it. It's like one of the prime goals for your player is to stick it to the man. So there's a whole lot of anti-establishment stuff, which again, when you look back at some of the genre touchstones, again, really, really plays those up. It's great at mashing up genre touchstones. So like my scenario, I took The Love Boat, The Bermuda Triangle, The Secrets of King Tut's Tomb, and a heist movie, and I threw them in a blender and hit puree, and what we got out was a whole lot of fun. I think the game does a really good job of the PBTA mechanics with the GM principles and your GM agenda and the GM moves. I think it really does a good job of, especially when you roll those mixed successes or those misses, of it just like ratchets up the tension and stirs up a lot of chaos and just turns things into like that madcap zaniness that was true of so many of 70s movies and 70s TV series. And it was just a hoot. Monkey Fun Studios does produce a number of adventures for Spirit of 77, and I did look to some of those for this one. And I've run Spirit of 77 a couple of times in the past. My go-to adventure is one that they have published, which is called Beast Bound and Down. I've run that in past GCOGs. That one is a mashup of Smokey and the Bandit and Bigfoot. And they've done a bunch of them, and they're generally pretty well written. I mean, they're PBTA games, but they give you the fronts, they give you some NPCs, they give you some set pieces you can run out, and they're just a lot of fun. I do admit that I copped the cruise ship map from a published adventure that they did, which was called like Cruise Ship from Hell or something like that, which was basically imagine the Love Boat, but a zombie apocalypse. What I'm less sure about, I think this game works great for one-shots, especially if you craft your adventure around 2 or 3 or 4 standard like genre touch points and then like go from there. I don't know how well this game would really work for campaign play. I suppose you could work it, but especially if you set up a premise, like for mine, it was, the PCs are there to steal some stuff from King Tut's tomb exhibit. But of course, you went into the Bermuda Triangle, and you were not you were expected to steal a scarab, but not get attacked by mummies. The kind of genre emulation is definitely the action adventure. I wouldn't try to use Spirit of 77 to do like a paranoid 70s political thriller. But it's a silly game. This is the kind of game where instead of that, you would do rocket-powered supercars fighting an army of robot gorillas. The other thing I'm less sure about in the game is some of the language in the book. I think the book really needed another pass of sensitivity reads. There's some stuff in the book that has some language that is racially charged that shouldn't be, particularly in the Kung Fu playbook. It's got a lot of Orientalist language. And there's a playbook that is based on the Dukes of Hazzard about the drivers that uses some language that just doesn't feel right today, especially in light of Black Lives Matter. So the character keeper that I produced for this game, I changed the names of some of the playbooks. So the driver, instead of using the language, I called it the Gearhead, based on Gearhead movies from the 70s, like Vanishing Point. I also changed some of the Orientalist language that was in the Kung Fu playbook. So I've actually corresponded with the writer of this game about some of that language, and this was completely unintentional. He didn't know some of that stuff, and I believe they're currently looking at a possible second edition of the game. So hopefully that language is going to be cleaned up in the future. But my takeaway is I love this game. It's a whole lot of fun. You can get a bunch of people together and just have a whole lot of madcap mayhem, and it just really sings for that kind of story.
So one of the things I had when I looked at Spirit 77, I played this with Rich a while back, is I found the organization of the information in the books really hard. It's hard to kind of figure out where we need to go, and that was the thing that kind of put me off from it. I don't know how you feel about that.
I would agree with you. I don't think the book is super well organized. In fact, I mostly played off of the play sheets rather than the book itself. It's got some world building stuff, which I can kind of take or leave. It's things takes place in the city. I generally prefer to put things in a real time and place rather than these generic, I'd rather set a game in Seattle rather than DC's Star City or Central City.
Okay. Sherri, anything? Thoughts? Anything you want to add?
No, though I do agree with Mike that a good character keeper can get you past information flow problems in the book itself. In fact, I have trouble reading a book of rules anymore. I'm like, okay, get me to the character keeper and I'll look through the book and the character keeper at the same time. Just kind of, it's presenting me the information at the time that I want, all in one place on sensible tabs. But, that's the thing is, when they started writing these books, they didn't have character keepers, and it's not like they could shove one into a book.
Mm-hmm. Well, enough about you. Let's talk about me. So I had a decent couple of months here at the beginning of the year. I did a more sort of longer series off Gauntlet. We're doing Dune Adventures in Imperium, and we wrapped up a Hearts of Wulin campaign that had been going for pre-pandemic. So it went for a very long time with the fantastic stuff. It actually showed me that Hearts could handle those very long campaigns. And then 13th Age, we're at level 8 in that game, heading up towards the end game, which is level 10. On the Gauntlet, I started a D&D 5e Strixhaven game. I also ran Hearts of Wulin multiple times for GCOG. I've got to play CBR:PNK that Alexi ran using the Kamigawa setting for Magic the Gathering, and that was really quite cool. I was seriously tempted to talk about that, but we've talked about CBR:PNK
Cyberpunk
recently. Cyberpunk. Yeah. And there was a quarterly of Godbound that we wrapped up, and a quarterly of Delta Green, technically Fall of Delta Green, that I also wrapped up. And that's what I want to talk about today is Fall of Delta Green. So Fall of Delta Green itself is the Gumshoe adaptation of the Delta Green setting with the time period surrounding the Vietnam War. Now, it connects with some of the established Delta Green history from the earlier Delta Green source book and the later new kind of updated timeline. But I haven't fully checked to see how much matchup there is. I recognize some crossover, but I'm not sure it directly flows in. So Delta Green itself is a game of modern investigation of the Cthulhu mythos, where you are dealing with what is called hypergeometric, outsider, unnatural influences. And your agents working for other government agencies with an uncertainty about Delta Green's agenda. So we did a modern adaptation of Fall of Delta Green. The changes weren't particularly difficult. We had to rename some of the abilities. add in a few new things. I also had a few other system tweaks. I used Yellow King style grouping and pushes for the investigative abilities, putting them in 3 categories. I didn't do background packages. There were a number of small tweaks, nothing huge. We really pretty close to the base Fall of Delta Green. Campaign itself was a quarterly, so we actually got 12 sessions, which was a little unusual for the Gauntlet. But I set it as starting right at the beginning of 2018, at the height of the Trump administration and the sort of ongoing disruption to government agencies and intelligence agencies. I really wanted a feeling of paranoia and chaos and tension in the background and uncertainty about how that connected up to what was going on in the game. So let me talk about what worked for me. I've been writing about this campaign on the Gauntlet blog, so here's a plug for that. You can find there my agent briefings for each of the 4 mysteries that we did. And then I've put up a separate post talking about the campaign concept, how I came to that, and then actually my full notes for the first mystery, like what I actually ran from. I'll link that in the show notes. So I want to talk about the play of Fall of Delta Green, the Gumshoe adaptation. First of all, as I said, it's pretty easy to adapt Fall of Delta Green to a modern setting. Like, it has the trappings, and they're really well done. Like, the trappings and the material for doing it in that 70s, 60s period, or on a theme there, really works. But it's not hard to shift it to, 50 years later. I had done a run of Night's Black Agents last year, and so I was able to look at those ability lists and see what had worked there and kind of adapt a few things. I wanted to talk about that because if you've listened to the Gauntlet podcast, you may know that when I did this solid Night's Black Agents game, I made some more significant changes to the Gumshoe system, including I shifted resolution over to a kind of a 2d6, like 6 or less, 7 to 9, 10 plus success level resolution. And I enjoyed that. It was fine. It worked decently. There were some hang-ups with it. But when I asked the players for this Delta Green game, 3 of whom had been in that campaign, what they wanted to play, whether they wanted to play something like that, whether they wanted to play the Arc Dream Publishing version with the percentiles, or whether they wanted to play Gumshoe, they said Gumshoe, and they wanted it kind of closer, more rules as written. And I was like, okay, we'll do that. And I will say, this worked, and maybe better than Gumshoe has in the past for me. I think it was a matter of tone and purpose in the group. Gumshoe itself has a lot of tracking and a lot of abilities and having to balance those out and figure things out. And sometimes, for me, when I'm playing, that gets in the way of things. In particular, I'm thinking about when I ran Ashen Stars, where it's not only the number of skills, it's that the skills have the most unintuitive names. Or when I tried to run a kind of a streamlined version of Mutant City Blues, and that really didn't click. And even Bubblegum Shoe. Like, in those cases, some of the elements of the standard general resolution kind of got in the way. But here I had a group who were very detail-oriented, who were very technically oriented, who were really willing to keep track of those numbers, and we were able to make that not kind of a hurdle to jump over. Now, that being said, general resolution works. It was good. I like that. I now have a sense of how I will make those choices for what I do with Bubblegum Shoe in the future. Like, I played, as I said, sort of Serpentine with Mike before, and I have to look and see whether I would try to do a more express version or whether I would keep the skills as they are there. And I say skills, but I mean abilities. I will say I really like the way that the Trail of Cthulhu solo, the Yellow King, does pushes where rather than associating your resources with individual investigative abilities, you kind of have a pool that you're drawing from. In my case, they have 3 pools and some picks with it. I think for the way I run, that's better. It runs more smoothly, and it actually allows me to put more pressure on people because we have like a smaller pool, but it can cover more things. And so I really like that. I will also say I had a concept coming in I had a sense of wanting to tour, and it's going to sound really pretentious, the American psyche. And I had some inspirations, in particular, Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, where they're crisscrossing the country and they're going and seeing different kinds of American mythos in that. And I think that really played out well. I also kind of knew with 12 sessions, you're going to get 4 cases. Like, that's about what you're going to get. And so I did prep that made it so that each case had a very different tone or approach or purpose or what they actually had to do between the cases. I think that can sometimes get overlooked, that, Delta Green has a premise of investigating, but you can tweak that. You really want to get games such that we did this scenario. When we come to the next scenario, it's turned 90 degrees as to what you're doing. And then we keep switching through that. That creates a really useful tension. So what I'm less sure about with Fall of Delta Green, damage and healing and lethality in both Fall of Delta Green and Standard Delta Green is still a place where we get caught, because stability and health can go negatives, and there are different levels for it going negative, and you have to spend to keep resistance rolls, and like first aid in combat just kind of whoosh, you're healed. People found that a little weird. So I have to think about how I want to manage that. It was probably the biggest concern at the end of the campaign about what people thought about this system. It also doesn't have any kind of like will or power stat, which you get in conventional Call of Cthulhu or even Trail of Cthulhu, which represents kind of magical energy. And I kind of put one in, and I think that was a useful tool. I will say, and this kind of echoes a little bit of what Mike was saying, while modern Delta Green is much better about it, the source material is Lovecraftian stuff, and it's also stuff that people wrote in the 90s, and there's a lot of cults with specific ethnic backgrounds and ethnic groups and, in the blood kind of shit that really, really bugs me. And of course, you see some of that because it is also taking place in a third world country during a time of conflict in this Fall of Delta Green. So yeah, it's stuff I'm not keen on. I really don't like that. I tried to excise that as much as possible. The last thing I'll say is Gumshoe is a game, and as a GM, you have to learn what your players can do. And I would say it was only in the last half, the back half of the campaign, that I knew how many points they had, what the resources were, how hard I could push them. And I think that that's a real challenge for a Gumshoe game master. Like when you're coming in the first time to do it, or even if you've thrown a scenario with pre-gens, it's hard to judge where the line is. How do I make the resources feel tight without being impossible? And that's a learning of those gauges is tough. I also will mention I have a playlist with the videos for this series. It's not something I usually talk about on the podcast, but I do have videos since I record almost everything. On the one hand, my takeaway, I would like to run this again. On the other hand, I don't say this very often. I really think I knocked it out of the park with this series. I think, given the players' response and stuff, I think I did a really good job, and they were very nice about it. I don't say that lightly. So I don't know if I would want to run it again. I don't know if I want to do a sequel. I don't know if I want to run it again. It's like I have done it. I've done it super well. Maybe put that on the shelf, do some other things. I have that. I ran a Vampire the Masquerade campaign years ago that I'm like, okay, done it. There we go. That's my perfect campaign for that. I don't need to go back to it. So I don't know. I'll open the table to the two of you.
So you're not going to go back and do Delta Green again? You're not going to?
I probably am not, at least not for a long time, until I've worn out the glow that I've got right now.
Delta Green's kind of a cyclical thing for you anyway, so I would say about every 5 years it pops up for you.
Yeah, in my head.
Yeah, so we'll see 5 years where you're at.
Yeah.
I've never run Fall of Delta Green. I've run a fair amount of Gumshoe. Most of that has been Swords of the Serpentine. And I am with you on how to make the players' resources feel like it's like they've got enough to get what they need done to do, but at the same time present them as a limited resource. One thing I've not done, I've not used the push pulls as a GM. So I know that was a tech from Yellow King, which I've actually not. I have a copy. I've read it, but I've never run nor played it. And Swords of the Serpentine does do the individual skills like Trail of Cthulhu does out of the box. So I don't know what the skill list is in Fall of Delta Green. I do know that in, say, Trail of Cthulhu, I think that list is too long and needs to be shortened.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I like about Swords of the Serpentine is designer Kevin Culp did shorten it. I think there's a total, I forget the exact number, but I think it's like a total of 20 skills and that's it. And I think that's about the right number if you're not going to do push pulls. If you're going to go any longer, if you're going to go more than 20 skills, I think going to push pulls is probably the way to go.
I'll have a copy of the Character Keeper up, and I'll link to that in the show notes. So if anybody wants to check and see what I did with the tech, to see what you think, or to deride me for my foolishness, you can certainly do that.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThruRPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks.
In our second segment, we have our guest bring a topic to us, a thing they've been working on or an idea they want to discuss. So, Mike, what do you want to talk about today?
So this is a little nebulous, so I'm hoping this is going to be more of a discussion than me talking. So as I mentioned earlier, I've been GMing a quarterly series of old school essentials on the Gauntlet. And as I consider myself primarily a story gamer these days, and I was GMing for a bunch of story gamers, so I kind of wanted to just talk about some of the story game techniques that I've been bringing to OSR play. So I know that at least if you look to RPG Twitter, which, maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah. That is a questionable decision.
Yes. You will regret it as many times as you
will celebrate it. I do it, and I regularly regret it. But if you look at RPG Twitter, there's often it seems to come from the like certain members of the OSR community that there's apparently some kind of tension between OSR play and story game play. And I never really saw the conflict there. Really, one of the things that I find most interesting in gaming, at least in the past 5 or 6 years, is the intersection of story gaming and OSR play, which is, I think, one of the reasons I like the game Trophy so much. Is that's especially Trophy Gold, which is very much which is a game designed to kind of bring those two together. So after having played a fair amount of Trophy and playing a lot of PBTA games, I decided I did want to go back to my roots. So Old School Essentials is a D&D retro clone of the 1981 Tom Moldvay edition of the Basic and Expert set. And that's the role-playing game that I cut my teeth on when I was 11 years old back in 1981. And I hadn't GM'd BX pretty much since the early to mid-80s. But it's a game I really wanted to go back to and give it a try. And so when I was chatting with a bunch of people on the Gauntlet Slack, I posed this as a game, and then Jim Crocker said, well, if you're going to do that, you should run the Against the Slavers series, because I haven't played that since I was a kid myself. So that's what I decided to do. So the first session or two that I ran, I was trying to put my brain back 40 years and run this. I was trying to give pretty much a straight up OSR game, and I was trying to put myself in an OSR GM mindset where the GM presents the world. The world is, I won't say static, but the world is what the world is, and the GM is the one who describes it, and the players react, and they look through the worlds through the eyes of their characters, and they interact as their characters, and you get emergent story out of that kind of play. And so that's how we started doing that. And it was fun, and it was cool, and then we got into combat, and, OSR combat it's a bit more streamlined than combat in a modern traditional game like in a Pathfinder or a D&D 5e, because you've got fewer options. It's basically I make my attack, I swing, and I either hit or I miss. And And again, it's a game that's designed so that there's not as much pressure on an individual die roll, so you roll a lot more dice. The problem I was encountering, especially in combats, was I was, like narrating. It almost felt like I was like an umpire, like a strike one, ball one, strike two, ball two, hit. Okay, it's the bad guy's turn. And I was trying to interject a little bit of narration in there. And in the Stars and Wishes I got it was either after the first or the second session, one of the players suggested that it'd be nice if we had a little more say in how things happened, especially in combat. And that made me think, well, we're all story gamers here. So in the next session we played, when we got to combat, I started in a combat, okay, you rolled a miss. Calf the fighter, tell us, how did you underestimate your opponent such that they deflected what you thought was going to be an obvious attack? So I just started interjecting the combats with basically leading questions. So the dice tell us ultimately what happened. You, the player, please tell us how we got there. And I think that really kind of elevated the game. And not just in terms of the interest of the players, because they were much more engaged in the combat. It was a whole lot less swing and a miss, swing and a miss. For one, it allowed the characters to present their characters as real badasses, such that, well, yeah, maybe I rolled a 4 on my to-hit roll. That doesn't mean I'm a chump. That means that I somehow telegraphed my blow to my opponent, who was much more skilled than I thought, and he was able to parry my blade. So I thought that was fun. Also, again, from story game techniques, given the players much more narrative control than is usual in an OSR game, allowed them to introduce other things to play. Like, for example, there was one scene where, and again, this was in the module, there was a trap where there's need to quickly go down a long flight of stairs, and they sprung a trap, and the trap was a whole lot of marbles fall from the ceiling and scatter on the stairs, which make running down the stairs really, really dangerous. Well, they had a magic item that allowed them to basically bypass that trap, but at the same time, they collected a whole bunch of marbles at the bottom of the staircase because, hey, these might come in handy later, which was a very OSR thing to do. You would take stuff from the environment to use later.
Mm-hmm.
And so in another one of these combats that was, a couple of adventures later, one of the characters says that, oh, I take a bunch of those marbles that we gathered earlier. I'm just scatter them on the floor here around them, so when the bad guys try to fight me, they're going to trip up. Again, that's not a thing that's handled by OSR rules, and so the way OSR handles that is you make a table ruling. So I made a table ruling, which was cool, but the fact that there were marbles on the floor and the fact that I had given my players more narrative control meant that the marbles on the floor became an interesting thing that everyone was kind of picking up and playing with. And those are not techniques that I would have thought to use, back in the 80s when I was, playing this game rules as written out of the D&D basic set and the D&D expert set. So that was just an observation that I thought that interjecting some story game techniques into OSR play, I think really elevated the game. I think it allowed people to have more fun, to put more input into the game, so that it wasn't just me narrating everything as the GM. Again, I'm not huge into the OSR scene, so I'm not sure how prevalent that kind of tactic is in the modern OSR scene, but I had fun with it.
Yeah, I saw somebody talking about the idea that we had retro clones, and then we had OSR, and now there's kind of a new OSR where people have broken away from retro clones and have been bringing in certain kinds of storytelling techniques to the game, which I think is really interesting. And I feel the tension that running D&D 5e, I certainly feel the tension that you talked about. And in fact, Jim Crocker, who played in your game, came to me and said, hey, Mike's letting us narrate our failures. Well, I'd like to do that for our characters. And I thought that was a great suggestion. And it really did help make those whiff moments better. And I brought it to Godbound too, because Godbound is very OSR based and started doing it there. So yeah, I think it's a real strong way to do it without I think the OSR theories is you wouldn't have the players adding details to the world.
That is very not OSR. That's a very story game thing to give the players narrative control over things that are not their character.
Mm-hmm.
But since I'm a story gamer, all of my players at this OSR game were primarily story gamers. It was something that they took to very, very naturally. If I were running for people who didn't have much of a background in story gaming and who'd only ever played trad games or OSR games, I've done this in the past at cons where I've tossed narrative control to players, and some people who don't have any story game tradition don't know what to do with it, and it can throw them out. It can throw them out of the moment. So I think if you're going to introduce that, especially to people who don't have that much of a background, I think you really do need to talk about that technique at the start of the game, just so that you don't catch players off guard. Because when I've done that in conventions, like for example, when I was last at PaizoCon, I ran a Pathfinder adventure, but I was interjecting it with some story game techniques. And 3 of my 4 players loved it. And I saw their eyes light up, like, wait, you're letting me narrate how this happens? Cool. Am I kind of a co-GM? But the 4th player shut down, did not know what to do with it, and told me after the game that he thought it broke immersion. He didn't want his character to be telling what the world was like, because that was the GM's job. So, I mean, I think this technique will work very well for some people. Yeah. It may not work so well for other people, but, this goes back to, not every game is for everybody.
Sherri?
I always come back to the thing that there is, one of the things is, I always remember Shu saying she likes to play OSR because sometimes she doesn't have the energy for story games. And I think there is a thing that goes, I can play OSR, I can play a trad game, and the world gets built around me. I can react to it, but I don't have to think of anything. And I don't have to explain why a thing happened and all of that stuff. And it means that you can kind of check out a little bit between what you can't do if you're doing the story game. So I kind of get that. There are times when you're playing a game and you're like, well, I just kind of want to come and hang out with people and, roll a die every once in a while. But then also, I have always resisted OSR because after playing story game, having someone else tell me what my miss looks like is sometimes hey, wait, no, that's not how I see it. And I have a really strong thing to it. I know it's OSR, you're not supposed to care about your character and if they die or if they look like fools. But, there's the thing is, that's my habit, and I'm one of those players, so but yeah, I get that tension.
So, yeah, again, as someone who really considers himself primarily a story gamer these days, I have a lot of fun handing my players narrative control because they'll throw things in that they will add story elements to the game that I hadn't anticipated, which means I have to react to that. And I've always been a very improvisational GM, and I've always some GMs of D&D really hate it when their players go off script and go off and do something that they hadn't anticipated. I have always, even before I knew what story games were, I'd always embraced that, and I just love the improvisation. So I think for me, at least as a GM, and again, speaking strictly for myself, I find throwing narrative control to my players keeps the game fresh, it keeps the game interesting, and it makes me enjoy the GM experience all the more. So I'm going to keep playing OSR games this way.
Awesome. Listeners, for our third and final segment, we discuss something that is lately inspiring us, providing joy to us. So, Sherri, what is giving you life?
I will tell you, from December through March, it has been only gray here. And I have to say that what is giving me life right now is spring. You can tell it's spring because it smells like mud, and there are crocuses. And the sunshine that has come along with it in some sort of miraculous way is if there is an actual sun that makes it through the clouds in this world now. It feels like a revelation. It's been so long. It's been so gray. And I actually went outside, and rolled up my sleeves and got some vitamin D for the first time in what feels like 3 years, but actually it was only 4 months. But it feels so good. And it is a little blinding in the mornings now, but other than that, really lovely, and it has been giving me life.
Mike, what has been giving you life?
So, especially in February and March, a piece of entertainment that's really been giving me life has been Star Trek Discovery Season 4. Ooh. I am a gigantic Star Trek fan. I was cool towards Star Trek Discovery Season 1. I thought Season 2 was an improvement. I thought Season 3 was a big improvement, and I thought Season 4 was really good. Especially the second half of the season. I think it really brought back a lot of what makes Star Trek, just the hope and the positivity about, the Federation as a true force for good. And especially, and this is kind of, I'm not going to reveal the final spoiler, but in the last like 3 minutes of the season finale, there was a fantastic piece of stunt casting that just made me shout for joy. I just loved that. I really loved it. Star Trek Discovery season 4, thumbs up.
Awesome. For me, it's that I decided to, after I think like 7 years that we hadn't, to pull out the paints and do some miniature painting. And thank goodness most of them have survived. And that sort of focused, singular activity, even though I'm not that great at it, I am pretty speedy at it. I can do table ready. And like that has given me focus here in sort of still the pandemic that I haven't had for a while. And so that's been really good. Even with my shaky hands and my little bit of arthritis, it has been a solid experience and I'm enjoying it. And that may wear off, but we'll see. It's given me life. And that's our show. Thank you so much for playing and listening with us. You can check out the show notes for links about the games we discussed. And you can find out more about the Gauntlet at www.gauntlet-rpg.com, where you can find articles, podcast info. We've got our blogs, got a bunch of resources there. So check that out. We also have a public-facing forums if you want to ask questions and things. You can follow us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. If you're interested in playing with the Gauntlet, please check out our forums or check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Gauntlet. Now, remember, the hard part is spelling Gauntlet right. Sherri, thank you for co-hosting today.
It was a joy and a pleasure, as always.
And Mike, thank you for coming on and helping us out today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this. This was great. Thanks.
Listeners, that's our show. Please subscribe, rate, all of those kinds of things, because it does help us out.